A diplomatic cable marked "Urgent" lands on the U.S. Secretary of State's desk at 3:47 a.m. Washington time. Within minutes, emergency calls are racing between the Pentagon, CIA headquarters, and the White House Situation Room. The message contains just 12 words, but those 12 words have just shattered 70 years of American foreign policy assumptions in Southeast Asia. What could a small archipelago nation of 110 million people possibly say that would send the world's most powerful military scrambling for damage control? The answer lies in the most spectacular diplomatic revolution of the 21st century, one that began not with missiles or trade wars, but with a simple, devastating phrase that no American policymaker saw coming. Before we dive into this geopolitical earthquake, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because what you're about to discover will completely change how you see international relations forever. For decades, Western diplomats approached the Philippines with the casual confidence of landlords collecting rent. They issued demands disguised as requests, threatened consequences wrapped in diplomatic language, and expected compliance with the certainty of gravity. American officials would fly into Manila with briefcases full of conditions, ultimatums about military bases, trade agreements that favored Washington, and stern lectures about democratic values. The Philippine response was typically polite, deferential, and accommodating. Foreign ministers would nod respectfully, presidents would shake hands for photographs, and behind closed doors, Filipino officials would quietly work to balance their nation's sovereignty with American expectations. This comfortable arrangement had persisted through multiple administrations, creating an illusion of permanent hierarchy that both sides had grown to accept. But something fundamental shifted in 2023 when a new generation of Philippine diplomats, educated at Oxford, Harvard, and the London School of Economics, began occupying key positions in Manila's foreign ministry. These weren't career bureaucrats content with managing relationships. They were strategic thinkers who had studied exactly how small nations could leverage their position in an increasingly multipolar world. They watched Singapore transform itself into a global financial hub, observed how Vietnam balanced relationships with both China and America, and learned from Switzerland's masterclass in profitable neutrality. Most importantly, they recognized that the Philippines possessed something increasingly rare in international relations: genuine strategic value that multiple great powers desperately wanted. The first shot across the bow came during a routine diplomatic meeting in 2023 when the U.S. ambassador to the Philippines raised concerns about Manila's growing economic ties with Beijing. The conversation was typical of hundreds that had occurred over decades, with American officials expressing their concerns about Philippine policy choices and expecting the usual reassurances. Instead, Philippine Foreign Secretary Enrique Manalo delivered a response that would be quoted in diplomatic circles for years to come. "Ambassador," he said with perfect diplomatic courtesy, "we appreciate America's interest in our sovereign decisions. However, we must respectfully remind you that the Philippines is not the 51st American state, nor do we aspire to be. Our foreign policy will be determined by Philippine interests, Philippine values, and Philippine priorities. We look forward to working with America as equal partners, should America choose to treat us as such." The response was clinical, professional, and absolutely devastating. In diplomatic language, Manalo had just told the American ambassador that decades of assumed hierarchy were over, that the Philippines would no longer accept being treated as a junior partner, and that future cooperation would occur between equals or not at all. The silence in the room stretched for nearly 30 seconds before the ambassador managed a response, but the damage was already done. Word of the exchange spread through diplomatic channels within hours, reaching foreign ministries from Tokyo to London to Beijing. The Philippines had just declared its independence, not from colonial rule this time, but from post-colonial assumptions about power and deference. The Americans initially dismissed this as political posturing designed for domestic consumption, a new administration trying to appear strong to Filipino voters. They continued with their traditional approach, sending senior officials to Manila with the expectation that behind-the-scenes pressure would restore the familiar dynamic. They could not have been more wrong. When U.S. Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo arrived in Manila 6 weeks later with demands that the Philippines choose between American semiconductor investments and Chinese infrastructure projects, she encountered a reception unlike anything in her diplomatic experience. Philippine Trade Secretary Alfredo Pascual opened the meeting with a statement that redefined the entire conversation. "Secretary Raimondo," he began, "we've prepared a detailed analysis of your proposals, but first, we need to address a fundamental misunderstanding. The Philippines doesn't choose between partners, we choose what's best for the Philippines. If American companies want to invest in our semiconductor industry, they're welcome to compete on merit, innovation, and value proposition. If Chinese companies want to build our railways and ports, they're equally welcome to demonstrate their capabilities. We're not interested in being America's ally against China, or China's ally against America. We're interested in being the Philippines' ally for the Philippines." The response sent shockwaves through Washington's policy establishment because it represented something they had never encountered from a traditional ally: principled defiance combined with strategic clarity. The Philippines wasn't being hostile or confrontational, they were simply refusing to accept the premise that their foreign policy should be subordinate to American preferences. More troubling for American strategists was the realization that the Philippines had alternatives. They weren't economically dependent on American goodwill, militarily reliant on American protection, or diplomatically isolated without American support. The economic dimension of this shift became apparent when Philippine officials began openly discussing their nation's growing integration with Asian supply chains that didn't run through American corporations or American financial institutions. While Western economists had predicted that Chinese investment in Philippine infrastructure would create debt dependency, the reality proved far more complex. Chinese companies were building roads, railways, and ports that connected Philippine producers to markets across Asia, reducing the country's traditional reliance on Western trade routes and American-dominated shipping networks. More significantly, these projects were creating jobs for Filipino workers, generating tax revenue for the Philippine government, and developing local technical expertise that would serve the country for decades. When American officials raised concerns about debt sustainability, Philippine Finance Secretary Benjamin Diokno delivered another masterpiece of diplomatic directness. "We appreciate America's concern for our fiscal health," he stated during a World Bank meeting in Washington, "but we must note that the Philippines has successfully managed its debt obligations for decades without defaulting, restructuring, or requiring bailouts. Perhaps America, given its own debt-to-GDP ratio of over 120%, might benefit from focusing on domestic fiscal challenges rather than lecturing other nations about financial responsibility." The remark landed like a diplomatic nuclear weapon because it highlighted a truth that Western financial institutions had spent years trying to obscure. The Philippines, despite being classified as a developing nation, actually maintained healthier fiscal metrics than most developed countries. Their debt-to-GDP ratio was manageable, their foreign currency reserves were substantial, and their economic growth rates consistently outpaced those of traditional Western powers. Diokno had just used America's own economic vulnerabilities to deflect criticism of Philippine policy choices, demonstrating a level of strategic sophistication that caught seasoned American diplomats completely off guard. The military dimension proved even more surprising to American planners who had assumed that Philippine security concerns about China would automatically translate into dependence on American protection. Instead, Philippine defense officials began articulating a strategy of defensive sufficiency that relied on asymmetric capabilities, regional partnerships, and diplomatic solutions rather than great power patronage. When Pentagon officials pressed for expanded American military access to Philippine bases, Defense Secretary Gilberto Teodoro responded with characteristic clarity. "The Philippines has no intention of becoming a battlefield in someone else's war," Teodoro explained during a security conference in Singapore. "Our military strategy focuses on defending Philippine territory, protecting Philippine citizens, and maintaining Philippine sovereignty. We welcome security cooperation with all nations that respect our independence, but we will not accept arrangements that subordinate Philippine security interests to foreign strategic objectives." The statement was particularly devastating because it exposed the fundamental flaw in American military strategy in Asia, the assumption that regional nations would sacrifice their own security interests to serve as proxies in American competition with China. Teodoro was politely but firmly explaining that the Philippines had no interest in hosting American missiles aimed at Chinese cities, serving as a launching pad for American military operations, or allowing Philippine territory to become a target for Chinese retaliation in conflicts that didn't serve Philippine interests. The diplomatic revolution reached its peak during the 2024 ASEAN summit when Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. delivered a speech that would be studied in international relations courses for decades. Speaking to an audience that included representatives from every major world power, Marcos articulated a vision of Philippine foreign policy that challenged fundamental assumptions about power, alignment, and sovereignty in the modern international system. The Philippines, Marcos declared, will not choose between East and West, North and South, or any other binary framework imposed by great powers seeking to divide the world into competing camps. We will choose the Philippines. We will work with America when American policies serve Philippine interests. We will cooperate with China when Chinese initiatives benefit the Filipino people. We will partner with Japan, India, Australia, or any other nation when such partnerships advance Philippine development, Philippine security, and Philippine prosperity. The speech was remarkable not just for its content but for its timing and setting. Delivered in front of American, Chinese, Japanese, and European officials, Marcos had essentially declared the end of the Cold War-era alliance system as applied to the Philippines. He was announcing that his country would operate as a truly sovereign nation, making decisions based on national interest rather than great power preference, and treating all potential partners as equals rather than accepting hierarchical relationships. The American response revealed just how unprepared Washington was for this new reality. State Department officials issued statements expressing disappointment with Philippine positions, as if the Philippines was a wayward child rather than a sovereign nation. Pentagon planners scrambled to revise strategies that had assumed automatic Philippine cooperation in potential conflicts with China. Trade representatives found themselves competing for Philippine attention rather than commanding it, offering genuine partnerships rather than expecting grateful acceptance of American largesse. The psychological impact on American foreign policy establishment was profound because the Philippines represented something unique in American diplomatic experience. Unlike adversaries such as Iran or North Korea, the Philippines couldn't be dismissed as anti-American or ideologically hostile. Unlike traditional allies such as Japan or South Korea, they weren't constrained by historical circumstances or security dependencies that limited their policy options. The Philippines was simply acting as a normal sovereign nation, making rational decisions based on rational calculations of national interest, and that normalcy was apparently revolutionary in the context of American expectations. Chinese officials, meanwhile, found themselves dealing with something equally unexpected, a Southeast Asian nation that welcomed Chinese investment and cooperation but refused Chinese dominance or exclusivity. Philippine officials made it clear that economic partnership with China didn't translate into political alignment with Beijing, that infrastructure cooperation didn't mean accepting Chinese territorial claims, and that mutual benefit required mutual respect rather than hierarchical relationships. The most sophisticated aspect of Philippine diplomacy was how officials managed to maintain positive relationships with multiple great powers while refusing to be subordinated by any of them. They accomplished this through what diplomatic scholars would later term principled multi-alignment, a strategy that distinguished between tactical cooperation and strategic subordination. The Philippines would work with any nation on specific projects or initiatives that served Philippine interests, but they wouldn't accept framework agreements that limited their future policy options or required them to consider foreign preferences when making domestic decisions. This approach proved particularly effective in economic relations where Philippine negotiators consistently secured better terms by maintaining multiple options rather than exclusive partnerships. When American companies demanded preferential treatment based on alliance relationships, Philippine officials politely explained that all foreign investors would be treated equally based on the value they provided to Filipino workers and communities. When Chinese companies assumed that their government's good relations with Manila would translate into special consideration, they discovered that Philippine regulators evaluated all proposals using the same criteria regardless of the investor's nationality. The cultural dimension of this diplomatic revolution proved equally significant as Philippine officials began asserting their nation's right to define its own values and priorities rather than accepting Western frameworks as universal standards. When European officials raised concerns about human rights practices, Philippine Foreign Secretary Manalo responded with a sophisticated analysis of how different societies might reasonably prioritize different aspects of human development based on their unique circumstances and challenges. The Philippines, Manalo explained during a United Nations Human Rights Council session, is committed to protecting and promoting human rights as defined by our Constitution, our laws, and our democratic institutions. We welcome constructive dialogue with all nations about how we can better serve our people's needs and aspirations. However, we must reject the presumption that any foreign nation or international body has the authority to dictate Philippine domestic policies or override Philippine democratic processes. The response was brilliant because it accepted the legitimacy of human rights concerns while rejecting the assumption that Western nations had the right to impose their interpretations of human rights on other societies. Manalo was positioning the Philippines as equally committed to human dignity while asserting their right to pursue that commitment through Filipino institutions rather than foreign pressure. You're witnessing diplomatic history in the making here, and trust me, the best is yet to come. So make sure you're subscribed because what Philippine officials did next shocked everyone. The economic results of this new approach became apparent within months as the Philippines attracted record levels of foreign investment from multiple sources simultaneously. American companies found themselves competing harder for Philippine contracts, but also discovering that successful partnerships were more sustainable when based on mutual benefit rather than assumed privilege. Chinese investors learned that Philippine markets were open to all comers but that success required genuine value creation rather than government connections. Japanese, Korean, Indian, and European businesses discovered opportunities in a market that was no longer dominated by American-Chinese competition but open to anyone offering genuine partnership. The strategic implications extended far beyond bilateral relationships as other Southeast Asian nations began studying the Philippine model for lessons they could apply to their own diplomatic challenges. Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand, and Malaysia all faced similar pressures to choose sides in great power competition, and all were watching to see whether principled neutrality could be maintained without sacrificing economic development or security cooperation. The most remarkable aspect of this diplomatic revolution was how Philippine officials managed to execute it without provoking retaliation from any major power. They accomplished this through consistent messaging, transparent policies, and genuine respect for all potential partners even while refusing subordination to any of them. American officials couldn't accuse the Philippines of being anti-American because Philippine policies treated all nations equally rather than favoring China over America. Chinese officials couldn't complain about discrimination because Philippine markets remained open to Chinese investment and cooperation. European critics couldn't claim that the Philippines was rejecting Western values because Philippine officials consistently articulated their policies in terms of democratic accountability and constitutional governance. The long-term implications of Philippine diplomacy are still unfolding, but the immediate impact has been to demonstrate that small and medium-sized nations have more options in the current international system than most observers had realized. By refusing to accept binary choices imposed by great powers, by treating all potential partners as equals rather than accepting hierarchical relationships, and by consistently prioritizing national interests over foreign preferences, the Philippines has shown that sovereignty isn't just a legal concept but a practical strategy for success in an increasingly complex world. If you've made it this far, you're clearly fascinated by how small nations can outsmart superpowers, so hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because we regularly uncover stories that reveal how the world really works behind the diplomatic curtains. The Philippine diplomatic revolution represents more than just one country's assertion of independence. It signals the emergence of a new model for international relations based on principled multi-alignment rather than exclusive partnerships, mutual respect rather than hierarchical dominance, and rational calculation of national interest rather than ideological alignment. As other nations around the world face similar pressures to choose sides in great power competition, the Philippine example demonstrates that there is indeed a third option, the option to remain proudly, strategically, and profitably themselves. The age of automatic deference to great power preferences is ending, replaced by something more complex, more democratic, and ultimately more sustainable, the age of genuine sovereignty exercised by confident nations that know exactly who they are and exactly what they want to achieve.